Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. It is February 2nd, 2022. That's 2/2/22 for those that are counting. And my name is Carl Hawkinson, and I am with the University of Minnesota Extension, Hennepin County, and I do a lot of agriculture and natural resource work in the county and in the Twin Cities. And I've joined up here with the Sustainable Farming Association, and we started this Ecological Service Livestock Network. The basic idea is returning livestock to the land and thereby mimicking nature in how we take care of these landscapes. You know, I've come to realize, and I think a lot of other people too, in the Twin Cities Metro, the 7 or 11 county, whatever number you want to choose. You know, I grew up here, and you drive around and things look green and nice, but this was all savanna and prairie of different kinds. And we have real sick landscapes. And so I hooked up with primarily a lot of the goat businesses. We call those the gateway species to the browsers to start whacking out the buckthorn and things and open up these lands. Last December, if you check out the webpage, we had cannibalic grazers that are doing sheep under solar panels. And briefly, I'm going to just share my screen here. And here is the webpage. I invite you to go there, and then we got upcoming events, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So it's very upcoming. And then we got past events. I just want to go here for a sec. Brad Hines is joining us today. He put on a nice presentation last week about the agrovoltaics at the Organic Dairy Research Station out there in Morris. I encourage you to check that out. Really, really cool work going on. And then we had, as I just mentioned, Cannibalic Grazers in December. And we have videos there. And then we've got all kinds of other things. We weren't really active too much this last year due to Mr. COVID in town, but we hope to get out and do more things. Yeah, and Katie Federal is here, and she's with FSA. And
Yeah.
Katie, you want to say a few words about your organization? And
Definitely. So SFA, Sustainable Farming Association.
yes.
Yeah, you're not the first, Carl. I've done it too. Yeah, and we partner with Carl for this networking group. It really embodies the approach that we take to sustainable and regenerative agriculture education, where it's farmer to farmer or like ag professional to farmer, and just community education essentially. We have like about 10, I think, regional chapters across the state and a few networking groups like this. And so that allows people to really connect with people right in their areas and organize and share knowledge with each other and help each other be successful as farmers and in our local food systems. And so that's kind of like a bird's eye view of SFA. Soil health has been one of our focus points for many, many years, and integrating livestock into the landscapes in order to achieve soil health benefits is one of our favorite things, basically, and that's very important to us. So we're really excited for this presentation today. And since you're here, I just want to make folks aware of these other events that I think that you'll really be interested in as well. My colleague Jared Luman, who I don't think is on, but he's been leading a livestock webinar series focused on farmers in Minnesota who are raising various species of livestock on pasture specifically. And so tomorrow we're talking goats, and then next Thursday we're talking pastured chickens. And so we're wrapping up the series, but last week we had bison, and then we've done sheep and hogs as well. So if you're interested in hearing from farmers in Minnesota about how they're raising these different species on pasture, you can check out the link I just put in the chat. And on that page, there's also the recordings from the other meetings too. But thought you might be interested in that because that tucks right in with what we're talking about today. And I'll pass it back to Carl.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. And this returning livestock to the land idea is becoming more powerful, and it overlaps and fits in with the soil health and the necessity of livestock in a healthy landscape. And The other way that we frame it is that we have graze obligate landscapes. The fact that these landscapes evolved with millions and millions of bison and elk and deer and beaver and ducks. And what are they doing? They're munching all the time. And you take those away and you see what happens. We've upset the balance. And on a farm, you take the livestock away and it connects with the soil health and all of that. And now we're talking about carbon sequestration. And as far as I can tell, and I'm not a big researcher on this, but grazing systems with livestock seem to be the only way to really sequester carbon that, raising organic matter is not the same as sequestering carbon. I mean, it's a good thing, but anyway, all these things kind of fit together. And I think it's really, really exciting. And we've also, as I mentioned, the grazing under solar panels, including habitat, native habitat, livestock, multiple benefits. So really, really exciting. And folks, if you want to just post your name and a welcome, if you're so inclined. We got too many people to do introductions, which is what we like to do in person, but yeah, just give a little shout out on the chat about where you're from or anything like that. So without further ado, one of our partners has been the Minnesota Native Landscapes, and they've been doing awesome work. And I've learned recently about how much they've been working with livestock and to further their goals of land management and ecological restoration, which I think is such exciting work. And so we have Audrey Lomax with us today, and she's with, of course, Minnesota Native Landscapes. And I will simply turn it over to you, Audrey, and introduce your company there and have a discussion about how you're using livestock. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Carl, and thanks so much for having us, both Carl and Katie. We're really excited to be here presenting for UMN and SFA. I'm going to share my presentation and then we'll get going, and I'll introduce MNL a little bit along the way.
And if you have any questions along the way, you can throw them in the chat there. Katie and I will be monitoring that. And as we get along towards the end, we can always open it up. If you got a burning question, feel free to interrupt. And so we have very informal, informative presentations here. So thank you so much. Go ahead, Audrey. There you go. That looks good.
Thank you, everybody. So yeah, I work for MNL. We're an ecological restoration company that started about 20 years ago. And we started in seed restoration or seed saving and restoration landscaping with native seed, and that's grown into a multifaceted ecological restoration company that does anything from stream bank, reinvigoration, bioengineering, vegetation management, prescribed burning, and now grazing and browsing is our newest service we offer. And I'm really excited to be here for all the reasons Carl just mentioned. I really do believe as well that animals are one of the best tools we have to restore some of our landscapes and sequester carbon, return nutrients to the land, and start to hammer at some of those understories that are completely covered with invasive species. So today I'm going to focus predominantly, I suppose, on the goats, because I think that is an area where we can really talk about that gateway, as Carl mentioned, into thinking about long-term management, and starting out with the goats is a great way to do that. And then I will speak a little bit to our sheep program as well, because that is the majority of our program. We run about 2,000 sheep on solar throughout the summer. So without further ado, I will get started. As I said, our conservation grazing program here is about 260 Spanish goats. We're trying to get a little boar in there to try to beef them up a little so they can put down larger buckthorns, but right now they're Spanish. And they do mainly woody and herbaceous management on the understories and pastures, prairies, things like that. We were able to browse a lot of acres this summer for us, 150, and we're looking forward to browsing more next summer. And one of the interesting things I think to think about is the goats tend to browse about 200 to 300 square feet per day. And that can really vary then on the acreage and the time it takes, depending on how high the buckthorn is and things like that. So just kind of a contextual number there. And for those of you that care about the stock days per acre, you can look at the numbers. The hair sheep we run are Katahdins. We run about 2,000 on solar, and we did 1,500 acres this summer. We work with 4 other farmers out west that are working on some of the solar sites as well. And we manage the vegetation program for that and manage the communications between parties for working with our collaborators, which is something we're really excited about doing. The sheep tend to consume a little bit more varied range in, acreage or square feet per day, in part because of the different vegetation that they can tend to be on within solar. They're either they could enter in on a really nascent young prairie that has a lot of weeds and kind of run through pretty quickly, which would be consuming the 500 square feet per day, or they could be entering into a very lush July, August prairie that needs a lot of time to get managed. But that is our program. We're continuing to grow. We've been working in this with livestock for about 4 years now. We're entering our 5th year. So we started in about 2017. And we're just really excited to see the impacts of what the livestock are doing and fit it into our services. We do think of it as one of the tools in our toolbox, and it's a wonderful tool to work with.
Audrey,
Yeah.
do you own the livestock, or is it the farmers you work with that own the livestock?
Yeah, that's a good question, Carl. So we own all of the numbers I just stated here. We own the 2,000 Katahdins and the 260 Spanish. And then we work with the farmers we work with on solar own their own sheep, and they tend to have wool breeds. All the farmers we work with do. And that is pretty common within the industry to have wool breeds, which is lovely. But yeah, that's it. And I was going to also mention, like Carl just did, please feel free to jump in at any time. I'm a very happy to have kind of a discussion and move along as we do go on to tangents a little bit if we want to. So I will mention that we do kind of talk about browsing and grazing in terms of this ecological service, and we are interested as a company, and then I think more broadly around how we can use the animals, when we should use the animals, rather than other services that we offer. And one of the things that I think it has the most kind of clear correlations is burning and browsing, because they do perform a lot of really similar functions ecologically. And as Carl mentioned, we did used to have thousands to millions of larger ruminants on land. And we also used to have a lot of fire on land, managing the land. So I think that the combination of the two of them is absolutely lovely. I also think it's important to talk about when they're similar and when they're different.
Audrey?
Yeah.
Kelly has a question. Kelly, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I should have jumped in on the last slide. When you say like the goats consume 200 to 300 square feet per day and the sheep, you said 150 to 500 square feet per day. Is that each animal?
Yep.
Okay, I was trying to figure out the math there because I'm used to thinking about per acre.
Yep.
Number of animals per acre. And so thank you for clarifying. That saved me some math.
Absolutely. No, that's a really good question. I wish I could go back. But yeah, it is the 200 to 300 per goat per day. And then that's why I kind of added in the stock days per acre to try to demonstrate kind of how much they can do per acre, how many animals you would need to get 1 acre done in 1 day.
And okay, so as long as you brought that up again, could you explain stock days per acre? I'm used to animal units per acre.
Yep, absolutely. It's just taking out the math of the animal units. I didn't add those in because often it doesn't really resonate with the groups I'm talking with, but it was really just saying like we have, it takes 145 goats often 1 day to go through an acre. So if you were to take that into animal units, you would just times that by 0.15 because I call them 150 pounds. Yep. And then you would get to your animal units. So I do have some of that math, happy to share it. But I just
wanted to make sure I was kind of understanding that properly.
Absolutely. Yep.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
for
Kelly
sure.
she raises beef, so she's
Yeah, I figured. No, I love
got
that.
beefs and another question here. Wayne, did you have a question? Wayne, I see you got your hand up there. I think you muted though. Did you have a question?
Yes, there. I thought I had. Anyway, yes, I do have a question. And that simply is, after the animals have cleared the area, is the brush, the undergrowth dead, or does it regenerate? Does it come back to life?
It does come back to life, for sure. And that's something that we'll go over. Just like, grazing on a farm, or browsing in the woods on a farm, burning things, vegetation returns. That's what the land wants. And the goats are not a one-stop shop tool. Using them in the woods is not going to be a one-time management event. It does take years of managing the understory with the goats in order to see be able to kind of walk away for a little while and come back and have a pretty solid understory. We are finding it, takes probably a browse or two for 3 years to really manage the understories in really thick and lush buckthorn filled areas. So
Okay.
no, it's not dead.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will get into that later, Wayne. That's a really lovely question. And I'll kind of talk quickly about the fire and browsing, and then we'll get into more of those details. Just for everybody's overview, I'm going to kind of chat about what we do, what the browsing does, some of the considerations around it, and then we'll go into some case studies, and we'll be able to really dig into what we've experienced and learned from our work. So yeah, I'll just go quickly. The prescribed burning versus browsing is the similarities are, one of the big ones is the escape factor. As goats are a gateway, but they're also an extremely difficult animal to keep in often. And so it's important to make sure that neither the fire is going to escape nor goats. And so that's a big similarity when thinking through that first step of starting a project, is where to place fences, where to place burn breaks, things like that, and very similar thinking around that. They also both do reduce herbicides, whether it's by just reducing the number of times herbicides need to be sprayed, foliar sprayed, or used as basal treatment, or completely eliminating the need for herbicide on a project. So they can do both of those things. The ecosystem and reinvigoration is really important. The trampling and just moving around of organic matter, shoving organic matter into the ground that animals do, is just as important and vital to the ecosystem as the burning and rapid nutrient availability that burning allows. So that reinvigoration really is seen on both. It can be quite different, and a lot of that depends on timing and species, but they do both reinvigorate in different ways, and it is a wonderful similarity. And then, as I said, the soil improvement is similar for both, and they both also do reduce thatch. There's times where the animals are better at reducing thatch because the burning is not allowed or a good idea in that area, and that's something we'll go over, but they both do a really great job of that. Of course, they both actually need thatch in order to survive the fire and the animals. I would also rather have a goat get away than a fire. I don't burn, in part for that reason, as I'm happier chasing goats. I think that Molly mentioned that's what would be her preference. The differences that they have are often the timing and weather. Like I said, the burn season is very short, and it depends very much on weather. It depends on the weather of the previous winter and fall, and it's just really necessary to hammer in as many burns as possible within a short time period, and then very weather dependent on the winds and rains and things like that as well. So a little more finicky in that area, and goats tend to do pretty well in most weather. They don't love rain, but they survive it. It's not impossible to continue working in rain, and luckily they're almost always under some beautiful oak trees, so they have nice coverage for things like that. The landscape and vegetation that burning and goats or sheep are best on, it can be a little different. For goats, it's really, we do predominantly use them in these understories, and they do a great job of hammering at vegetation that's woody and herbaceous, things that burning don't necessarily do as well with. Burning tends to do better with grasses, dried up grasses and things like that. And often is nicer to do in open areas. Of course, it's possible to do in understories that have been managed for thatch, but tends to be nicer in these open areas, as seen in the picture on the top. And then the dependency on fuel loads is a little different, but also sort of similar in the sense they do need both fuel to survive, but the fuel can be quite different. And I think there's a lot more room for variation with the small ruminants in what they're going to be able to cover. And again, that burning is really best for fine grasses and thatch. And then I think public personnel safety and personnel availability and flexibility, I think both of those are really important. Just thinking about, people, making sure that we have enough people to burn at the right time in the right places, and that public and, the public is aware of what we're doing and that it's safely done. I think for grazing, there's a lot more room. It's spread out over a lot more time. There's less need to have a lot of people in one area working on something at once. And the public and personnel safety tends to be slightly less concerning, as the burn getting out is a lot more concerning than a goat. And then the nice thing about goats is that they provide sustainable food production, something that burning doesn't do, and something that I think is really important when talking about, ecological restoration, is how we can tie in the sustainable food production with the services that we're doing, and kind of bring both of those things to light and utilize both, because I believe people will continue to eat meat. I think it's really cool when people are able to do so, eat meat that has been also supporting the landscape. So
bingo. I want to chime in here and say that it's one of the things we're working on is, I don't know how many acres of degraded woodlands are in the metro, but we could produce milk and meat and honey and wool and all kinds of things from these lands if we just change our idea of farming and all of that. And I also wanted to say, what I've seen, goats are just the best thing for when you first start on a completely buckthorn infested, wood that is so thick with junk. I don't want to say junk, but with, unmanaged, and the goats will open it up and you can start to see what you have. So I think they're really great at, that's why I call them the gateway animal, to get in there. And, and if it's hilly, you can't even get in there to do anything. It's so thick sometimes. But anyway, yeah, really cool.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, Carl. I think that that's something, and I have pictures that demonstrate how helpful it is just to have the goats go through, open some space up, and then be able to see what you need to manage, because it can be very difficult sometimes walking into our woods right now, just seeing walls of buckthorn and having the vision of what needs to be done. I completely agree with you on that. Okay. All right. So I do want to quickly go over some of the applications we use for browsing. And, or I should say that applications that browse is used in by variants of what people are doing with animals right now. And so, as Carl mentioned, we did used to be a savanna, and savanna understories are really taken over by invasive species right now across a lot of the deciduous forests, and we're experiencing that in sort of the southern part of the state predominantly. And the picture above is an area of southeastern Minnesota that used to be a savanna area and now has been kind of overruled with buckthorn. The property owners have been working for years on trying to reduce the buckthorn, but have kind of hit a limit and brought the goats in. And it's really lovely to see what they were able to do in just a few weeks. We went in 3 times on the property and this last summer, and were able to really impact the buckthorn. But I think this picture really does show something important, and it's kind of tricky to see without a pointer, which but the buckthorn, the gray line kind of behind the dog here, our herding dog Gus, is all buck buckthorn stems, and then along the line on the top here, a little bit above that, there's a green line that's all the tops of buckthorn that the goats did not push over and impact. So we are learning through these projects what the limits of our goats are and how important it is to start to train our goats and get genes into our herd that are going to help support the functions that we're trying to do. So I think this is both a lovely demonstration of what goats do. Before we entered this site, we would have seen a picture of just straight green wall for about 3 acres. And when we left, you were able to see across the entire 3 acres up the hill and watch the sunset. The buckthorn will grow back, but it's a start to allowing management to continue and to continue to try to reinvigorate some of that savanna understory.
Yeah, now you can get in there.
Yeah.
We got a question here.
Oh, Tyler, yeah.
How do costs compare?
Yeah.
And then you have been breaking in and out. It's better now, but sometimes if you turn off your camera, but let's continue and see what happens.
Yeah.
Between goats and fire.
Yep. I actually don't really know comparison there, Tyler. I'm sure I can chat with Mark and get back to you on that one. But I will say that I know it does depend a lot on the different considerations of the property. An example would be we were both bidding for a property that
now you're breaking up again.
Burn head, Mark. Okay, I'll turn my camera off.
Let's see if that helps. Yeah, sorry.
Mark and I are the head of our burn crew, and I were both bidding for a property, and he came in about another third higher than I did because of the considerations around the number of pine trees that were on the property and having to make sure they were creating enough burn breaks for those pine trees. And we came in lower because the cost of fencing for that around those pine trees was going to be low. Generally, we're around a similar. Again, those considerations will really change it. For us, the main considerations around price are the cost of the labor to fence. So, you know, a cliff on the edge where the goats won't go, or a lake maybe is a better example, might cost a lot less because we don't have to fence off a big portion of it. And for, you know, burning, I think it would be the same where they're heading into if they're heading off of into a lake or something, the cost would be less as well because there's a big burn break there. I don't think that's maybe the most helpful, but that's what I can give you now on cost comparison. But I can certainly follow up on that with you if you remind me, Tyler. Sweet, good. And then yeah, I'll kind of run through a little bit of this quickly and just say that yeah, we kind of do this habitat restoration. We do the goats will do fire risk reduction. I think that's an important part too that Carl was mentioning, is if they can get in and really impact the invasive woody or bait species in previously. Grazers would come in and then fire would take over.
Yeah.
So, and then I will say also, one of the areas where I'm most of using goats, either prior to or for silvopasture, I think goats are a really great opportunity to open up woodlots to the long-term animals. And I think a lot of folks that are, you know, a lot of farmers, folks like that have land, have a few woodlots that maybe it's time to look into and see what we could do about managing a little bit to provide a little bit of extra income or ecological function for the farm. Moving past some of the rest of the preparation, going into pest control, I think that's another application that's really important to look at for goats, particularly in around sort of these invasive species that may hold on to pests in our forests. Things like ticks and soybean aphids are major issues right now in our deciduous forests, and folks are finding that ticks are more abundant in forests with barberry, buckthorn, things like that on the understory. So one of the areas, so soybean aphids is an area where I'm very interested, and I know the U of M is doing a study right now, or it has been previously, on whether soybean aphids are increased in fields that have buckthorn adjacent. And we're finding that soybean aphid, or soybean larvae, tend to overwinter on buckthorn, and then multiple generations of soybean aphids are able to emerge in the spring and get a really big head start on reproducing, excuse me. And so that's an area where I think using animals to manage the land nearby soybeans, things like that, can again reduce the need for chemicals and management, and support farming incomes and things like that. Finally, I will say the methods I think are really important to consider in terms of thinking about this in a full spectrum are trample seeding. We do a lot of that we bring in a buckthorn replacement mix, we call it, and it is a predominantly cool season grass mix that is very shade tolerant and does well under deciduous forests. And we bring that in at the time when we're bringing goats in to trample seed. If we are returning multiple times throughout the season, we'll often bring it in at either the most damp time. So that would probably be spring for trample seeding if we're going to be there multiple times, or sometimes we'll wait until the end to try to allow that seed to have a head start before we would want to come back the year later. So we do play around with timing around trample seeding a lot. Another area that's interesting, and one that we are working on, is girdling. We've had our goats working on that project for the last month and a half, and we are finding that in the area near Fargo where they are, it's a little too cold in December and January for them to do a great job of girdling. But we are learning that they do like to girdle as long as there's enough nutrients flowing through the cambium just under the bark.
Audrey, we have a question here, and
Yeah, I see Molly's.
If you're grazing for 3 years, what year would you trample seed?
Yeah, I think I would trample seed personally, probably if it was just a grass mix in that first year. And then I would probably, I guess it depends on the project, of course, but if it's already been forestry mowed and the buckthorn is down to goat height and there's management that's already started happening, I would seed before the goats go in the first time, or at the time they go in, to try to allow that grass to come up as quickly as possible in the spring and establish before the before the less, or the hotter, drier July starts. And then I would also send the goats through quickly and really watch to make sure that the moment they're done with the buckthorn, we're really moving them out so that we're not asking them to start eating those grasses we've just seeded. Again, to allow those grasses to establish and thrive. And then probably the next browse I would send them through again, and then probably allow them to stay a little longer and eat down some of the lower vegetation, looking mainly for buckthorn seedlings at that time. And they would likely find the buckthorn seedlings, and then we would they would probably eat a little grass, and then we will move on. That tends to be sort of the method for things. And Gary asked what grasses and forbs are in your cool season mix. That's something I can send you later. I actually don't remember off the top of my head right now what that mix is.
I wanted to chime in also with the girdling. Jake at the Goat Dispatch has been experimenting with girdling buckthorn over winter, and he's had good results.
Yeah, he's been doing that with U of M, I believe.
Yeah, they've been researching it, and also, keeping outdoors in the winter with calf hutches. And so really interesting work there. It's in our webpage there somewhere.
Yeah, it's one. Yeah, I've seen some of his things, and they're really wonderful. I really suggest checking out what he's been doing. Definite inspiration to us. Gabe, yes, it is the buckthorn replacement mix on our website. And that's really lovely to hear. You've been involved with Goat Dispatch for the girdling for the last 2 years. Very curious to hear about that.
Yeah.
And then finally, I guess I will say just a reminder that the repeat browsing is really important. Coming back in after the buckthorn has been impacted the first, even second time, is going to ensure that that land is continuing reinvigorate and not return back to the buckthorn. And I think one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is the nutrient addition, nutrient addition when we bring goats into these understories. There are folks that are studying right now that added nutrients is part of the problem in these understories. So I wonder sometimes if adding goats in is helpful, but I do think that they do provide that ready nutrients for grass and mixes and things like that to get a head start and can be extremely helpful. Another thing that the goats will do is they do sterilize about 70 to 80% of the seeds they eat. And so that's a really lovely function of theirs as well, is kind of removing some of those seeds from the landscape. Thanks so much, Carly, for adding in our buckthorn replacement mix. If anybody's interested in looking at what that mix is, it's been added into our chat on the side here. So please take a look at it. It's been really lovely to work with it, and we see it coming up quickly and really wonderfully. I have another question here from Ralph. Have you done any work in Wisconsin under managed forest law practices? I have not. I would love to talk about that, and I don't know enough about it, so I'm very curious.
I could chime in there. We own some property in Wisconsin and we have managed forest law. And for those that don't know, you get a big tax break for doing these long-term forest management plans. And if it's open, you get even more of a tax break if you allow hunting. And I've been struggling with that because you fill out a form to say what your goals are, and our goals are wildlife and all kinds of things and not just board feet. And so, and I did get cost share for doing some buckthorn work, and so it's kind of a gray area whether I could do that. I think I can do it in some places, but not others. I think they're coming around, but basically you have to convince them that you're not grazing the livestock for profit. It's a tool, but they're hesitant at this point.
Yep. I find that is a common thread, that it's important to convince folks that we are using livestock as tools sometimes. And Ralph is saying they did 3 iterations to get the way they wanted. Was that 3 browsing with goats? Using 3 iterations?
Go ahead and unmute and chime in, Ralph.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Yeah, we own 40 acres in Wisconsin that we've been managing for about, 45 years now. Started in 2000 under managed forest law, and it took 3 iterations to get, I think, to the point where, my fuzzy environmentalist leanings actually jibed with the DNR's mandatory practices. And some are not mandatory. And we have 5 acres they allow a certain percentage of the land to be in or outside of the actual forest. So we have about 5 acres of prairie, which has been, we've been watching for the last 40 years, prairie plants migrating up out of an old ditch. It was a county road ditch. When they moved the county road, it was before they had started spraying, and so they'd just been mowing, and so we have all these things migrating into that field. But now we have jack pine coming in, and I've been thinking about burning. So this is the first I've really heard about the opportunity to consider grazing as an alternative to burning.
Good. That's wonderful. I'm glad to hear that. And I do think your point is really important, of the landowner needing to match up with the entity that's going to be funding the project, or and I found that a lot is the need to really have a few iterations to make sure that there is a cohesive and a jive between the landowner and the managers or the folks funding it. So I think that's really important. And I'm really glad to hear that this example of using burning and grazing is being taken well, because I think it's really important. And I do think, sheep and goats are really great at reinvigorating prairies for areas that if you're not interested in burning or you can't burn in your area, they're a wonderful replacement for that.
Yeah, my neighbors are very concerned about burning. They're going to put up a major fuss if I burn any time besides when there's still snow on the ground in the woods.
Yep.
We make maple syrup during that time, and so it's like I'm not going to be out there, dividing my attention. So it just is. I'm delighted to hear about the grazing.
Good. I'm so glad to hear that. And Molly has some experience that she's sharing that they've had results with Savannah and Prairie coming back after grazing goats. Most impressed with how goats have eliminated garlic mustard and to lesser extent, Dame's Rocket. Yes, they really like to eliminate the garlic mustard. That is very true. I'm glad to hear that, Molly. So I will move on to the next bit here. I'm not going to stay on this slide for long. Part of my reason for having it was just so it was here for folks that want to see it later. But I do think it's important. A lot of people ask me what goat browsing preferences or what the goats prefer when browsing. And this list is not in any way exhaustive, but some of the things that we come across often and some things that I think are helpful to think about. I'll just mention that one of the things around each of these different species is that they do have slightly different management needs, and are managed more or less easily over time. For example, poison ivy tends to be one of the early ones that, goats love it so much, they'll return to it over and over, and it tends to lessen quickly in a forest once goats have been put in it. So you see a reduction a little faster with that. And then multiflora rose on the other end is in the rose family tend to be quite difficult to get rid of. The goats love them. They go after them just as much and they come back very quickly and vigorously. So that takes, more applications to reduce the number or the amount of multiflora rose or anything in the rose family in the understories. And just, I think that's important when thinking about this restoration process and ecology is, having patience and understanding for each individual species and the way that they uniquely come together on a piece of property. And using the goats they're not going to uniformly and perfectly reduce everything at the same pace. And sometimes you'll see a species sticking around for a little longer. That doesn't necessarily mean anything is being done incorrectly. It might just mean it's a little bit more of a resilient species in that understory. The secondary preference area, I think most of the ones in my opinion, that are in that category are the goats tend to be a little more picky about, in that they might only want to hit that species at a specific time in the growing season when the sugars are really high or things like that. And I've seen that a lot with the sumac and ironweed, particularly, where they'll walk past it for months on end and suddenly just completely eat all of it at once. Thistle and things like that, maybe just sometimes more depends on how far into the growing season it is and how tough it is for their tongues. And then the undesirable and toxic species, I have found goats tend to avoid, or any species, any animal will tend to avoid something that's toxic to them or particularly undesirable. And then from a management perspective, the way I think about it is just to make sure that that is never the only species available to our animals. So they never need to choose a species that might be toxic to them. And a good example of that would be white snake root. They really don't go after it. They don't eat it in the understories where I manage them until, but I've never left them in a spot where they would only have white snake root to eat. And that is not an extremely toxic plant to them. It's more toxic in it. The toxicity comes out in the meat and the milk. But again, they know that it's not good for them. So they just avoid it. And I kept ground ivy and Virginia creeper on that list because I have never found goats that will eat those two species, and I find them often in our deciduous forests. And I really wish they would, but it's just not what they do. So we'll move on to who we work with. We work a lot with, we work with many different groups, and from private landowners all the way up to NRCS, which is a federally funded program. And that span and who we're working with is really important when thinking around the different goals that we're trying to meet, and different abilities of the folks that we're working with. So, there's different constraints and different interests that each group has for managing the land. At the end of the day, I find from, private landowners, schools, foundations, DNR, a lot of the people, most of the groups we're working with do have the same goal of just restoring that land to be able to be used in a recreational or agricultural space. So I think that's really a nice tie-in, but making sure that we're kind of meeting those different needs across the board is really important. And then I have added in that we do work with solar developers and owner operators a lot. For being that we're predominantly on solar, that is one of our major customer groups. And it's a really different customer group. Often, by the time a private landowner is coming to us, they've done a lot of research and thinking around what they want from their land, and are very invested in that restoration of their land. DNR and the Soil and Water Conservation District folks, have a lot of experience in land reinvigoration and land restoration. So I think those experiences and thought put into it on the sort of the goat side makes that work and that communication really different than on the solar side, where we're working with folks that really do care about the environment and the land, but maybe don't have as much experience in thinking around ecology and the time it takes to, investment it takes to really manage land well. So we're really fortunate to be able to work with so many different wonderful groups. And then I'll quickly cover some of the considerations, and we'll talk about them as we go into our, conversation around some of the projects that we did last year. So one of the main things, making sure that everybody's aware this is a long-term ecological process. We try to make sure right off the bat that everybody in the conversation knows that the goats aren't going to come through and manage one time. We also make sure that folks know the suite of options for managing the land and provide a lot of consultation around that. But again, long-term. Wet soils are really big for us. Goats don't really like getting their feet wet. It can be really helpful when you want to manage a piece of land where there is a body of water next to it. The goats really don't go near the water unless they're interested in a little bit of drinking. I know that can be a controversial subject, very interested in chatting about that. But we do allow that in a lot of ways because they don't like wet soils. The drought was really nice because they were able to go into and manage some areas where they wouldn't normally go. Proper fencing, again, goats are escape artists. They love to escape. We use electronet fencing that's, 38 inches, 36 inches high. So, and then 150 feet long. And we string up, however many electronet fences we need to in order to get the job done. But, the landscape, rocky soils, large slopes, uneven terrain, with the addition of lots of vegetation, really impact how we're able to fence that area and make sure that the goats are in. But generally, they do a great job with the electronet, and we are hooked up to solar powered fencers that sometimes we will create an electricity break in the fence and put 2 fencers on that fence just to make sure it's nice and hot. We're going for kind of as hot as we can get when we're out in those sites to make sure the goats know that they need to stay in. And a lot of that is goat safety as well. It's never great to allow animals to test fences and find that they're not on and hot. Potable water access, really important. We bring a trailer around with us everywhere we go. although there are some sites, I should say, that we are able to tap into a spigot or something like that and put a stock tank with a float on it out for the goats to use. That's always really helpful. And we're always looking for partners that have water access nearby, because it really does reduce the labor and the cost of the project. Predation is oh, go ahead, Carl.
Audrey? Yeah, just a quick question from Kelling. What fencer do you use?
We have a number of different fencers, but this year we did go with the IntelliShock from Premier One, and we really liked it. We went with the largest we could go with. And yeah, yes, we did. I think the nice thing about those is they're really, they are very dependable, and they've done I think Premier One's done a really great job of making them very mobile. They have a nice handle. All of the pieces are very quickly assemblable and pretty user friendly. So it's nice when we have, landowners that we're working with and they need to be able to get into the paddock or something, they can use that fencer quite easily. That fencer, Premier One says, covers about 1,350-foot electronet fences. And we try to max out at about 10, just because we do have a lot of thicker vegetation that we tend to go through, which grounds out some of that electricity along the way. Anything else in the, oh, good. I'm glad I answered that. The predation issue, we didn't really have an issue with it actually this year. None of our goats had any signs of predation. We didn't lose any to predators. And we were really lucky with that. We had more issues with the sheep this year, I think in part because they were not in electronet. Electronet does a really great job of keeping predators out, and in part because they don't have horns. Horns do a really great job of making sure predators stay away too. So that is a nice reason, we do have goats with horns. That is a nice aspect of it. I think there's some other things that make it more difficult to manage goats with horns. And I do get a little concerned sometimes about them getting stuck, but we haven't had an issue with that yet. And Carl is advertising for Premier One for everybody. So go look at the chat. Then public interactions and communications, really important across the board, whether we're working with goats or sheep, the government or solar operators, just making sure everybody's aware of what we're doing, why we're doing it, and that, our level of animal care standard and our welfare standards. So we really try to share that with folks, let them know where we are and that we're working every day to make sure our animals are well cared for and doing the job that they need to be doing. And again, that communication around shared goals and clear objectives is really important from the outset to the end.
Yeah, this is the goat businesses I've been working with. This is a big deal. This is a big part of what they do, especially if you're in the metro.
Yep.
With large populations of people that don't know anything about livestock.
Yep.
The goats are great because they're cute and friendly, and they're a gateway animal in that way too. But
yeah,
how come they don't have water? And people have these questions. It's great for starting conversations like, what are these goats doing here? Aren't they cute? Well, it's not a petting zoo, but sometimes they're lame and they limp, and sometimes they, so people, okay, these aren't house pets. So you have to go through all these kinds of things. So it's something that the businesses are highly attuned to and work a lot on. But it all can become, I think, an opportunity to explain to people, well, yes, we're getting rid of the buckthorn and so forth and so on, but we're also, then you can launch into conversations about ecological restoration and so forth. But the public, out in the rural area where people are, more familiar with livestock, and it's perhaps not as a bigger problem. And plus there's nobody around, maybe if it's really rural, but in urban areas, Diversity Landworks is grazed over at the Minneapolis Park Board, Minneapolis Parks, and that required double fencing because they couldn't have electric. Required somebody to stay on site 24/7, which greatly increased the cost, et cetera, et cetera. So different considerations with different properties.
Absolutely, Carl. And I think that's really important. We do like you said, the diversity land or the center of Minneapolis is going to be really different than a farm out in Buffalo, and making sure that there's the communication around that. And we do have public interactions where folks are concerned about our animals. Like Carl said, sometimes they limp or things like that. And it does provide an opportunity for education around animals. It is tricky because that does take labor and management to do effectively, I think. And the other piece is that we do have folks that are, and then folks are, like Carl said, folks are very interested in what the goats are doing. They understand the eating of the buckthorn, and then it does really provide a beautiful opportunity to get deeper into managing lands and talk about it in a more broad sense. Really explain the importance of having these lands managed for wildlife and for human recreation. And so, yeah, they're just a wonderful gateway tool. I will say Eric just posted that he's found Cyclops fence, it looks like, to be far superior, and I'm very curious, and I will look into that in a minute once I get off this call, as I'm sure others will. And Molly mentioned that in the park that Molly, the park attendance when they got goats increased, but people are harder to manage than goats. And I have found that as well. I do like the livestock portion. Overwintering, I think this is a really big and a very important part of what we do because it drives up our cost a lot. Living in Minnesota is, tricky environment, and it's expensive to overwinter here because the winter is long and harsh. And so the infrastructure needed for it, the fuel, meaning feed really needed to keep the animals going, and the labor to do so is important to consider for every farmer that's working in doing this, and every company that is, because I think were we able to work year round and manage lands year round in the way that we are in the summer, our costs would be able to go down, and we would have a different system. So it's something I do try to remind folks of when we talk about costs, particularly with cost comparison across the country. Welfare management, yep, we just, it takes a lot to manage the amount of animals we have, and it takes a plan around our animal welfare standards and sharing those out. So it's just, again, that labor piece and managing for the best welfare that we can feasibly manage while also trying to get the job done. With that, again, labor is just a huge consideration in what we do. It takes a lot of work to manage animals. It takes a lot of work to put up fences and mobilize sheep. That part, moving the animals, is really important. I think it stresses our animals out a lot to get moved around the way they do. And so we try to treat them extra special nice when they're not being moved around, or when we are, have put them in a new spot. They always have standard care or, standard minerals, a protein tub on site, water, things like that. But we do really consider the stress we put them under by having them go to new spots all the time, where they're having to think through predator issues, find a new spot to sleep, find their friend when getting off the trailer, anything like that. And it's just a stress on them that we do consider a lot. And then finally, that piece of weighing multiple objectives. I find within a lot of projects, there are many people that really, really care about the land that we're restoring, and that there are multiple ideas around what the objective should be, and coming to a consensus and understanding for the long term, I think is just super important. And we really enjoy doing that with folks. And so we're really lucky to be able to do so.
Audrey?
Yep.
Wayne has a question here.
Yeah.
Speaking of animal management, do you lamb and kid on pasture during the summer?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question. We do lamb on pasture in the summer. We have not kidded, but that's something I would potentially consider kidding. The thing I don't like about that idea is that we only really have our goats in electronet, and I think it's important to train them with a human around for the first time being around electronet, just so that if a kid doesn't respect it and maybe doesn't really feel it because they're so light, they don't run through it and get caught. So I would have a lot more reservations about kidding in the work we do. on pasture. But for the lambs, we do we lamb under the solar panels, and it seems to work wonderfully. We've had really high rates of survival and really good growth rate by lambing on pasture. That is one of the wonderful things about solar panels, is they provide a lot of shade. So ewes are able to kind of wander off, have their lambs on a really clean, fresh pasture, have fresh food nearby, and be able to access water and mineral very easily and quickly. And we're just find great results with it. I will say we're very careful about what solar sites we do lamb on, because there are some solar sites where we do face higher predator pressure. Oh, Gabe kidded in the paddock that was 40 acres, so perhaps lower issue due to ample space. I think that that's really, yeah, wonderful. 40 acres is a really great amount of space to kid. So it was Jake that did it. It was not Gabe. So yeah, I think 40 acres is great. Were you in electronet fencing at that time? 40 acres is a lot to electronet fence. That's awesome. I'm really excited to hear that. I would love to hear more about that. Yeah, 40-acre paddock for kidding. Tyler, what question do you have?
Yeah, this is connected with the kidding. I'm just curious. It seems like, you know, working these invasive species over is probably best suited to adult goats. And I'm just curious, you know, connecting with this kidding, you know, whether or not this invasive species grazing is well suited to, you know, a high quality, you know, young goat meat product, you know, enterprise for a farm, or if, you know, the young goat sort of aspect of or part of the enterprise is sort of best separated from, you know, the summer grazing with the adults. I'm trying to figure out whether there's like a trade-off between meat quality on the younger animals and this type of browse grazing. I know that, you know, the browse is, you know, suited to goats, obviously, but I'm just curious about, you know, from a meat production standpoint.
100%. I think that's so important. And I would say that I think, Bailey said that Bailey raises goats for meat in addition to targeted grazing and has been pretty pleased with the size of carcass and quality of meat. That's good to hear, Bailey. I was going to say kind of the exact opposite. We have not been impressed. And I think that is a really important piece. We've considered trying to hold our kids back and grow them on other species such as grass and maybe a little creep feeding situation, because I think we've found our kids tend to be a little bit less, you know, less large than we are looking for, I will say. The carcass size tends to be probably a good 3 to 5 inches smaller come 10 months old. Maybe that's an exaggeration, 2 to 3 inches smaller than some of the other goats that we have that were born at the same time, but weren't out on buckthorn for the whole summer. And so we are really looking at whether not only the quality, but the quantity of meat is impacted enough to keep the kids off the land. That is going to take a different management around kidding time, and I think we will potentially move to sort of a fall kidding to allow for lactation, weaning, and then having the does out on land. But it is all really important, and I think probably we will find, maybe we won't, but we might find that, yeah, buckthorn is not the best nutrient for growing. Tyler said, oh, wow. Tyler said, I can't really. Very interesting, important details for people considering goats to think through. I think that's really true too. It takes a lot. There's a lot of little considerations around this. So I try to get out as much as I can because I think making sure people know what's happening. But Bailey mentioned, for context, they raise Kikos, very cool, and have kidded in April, May with harvest in October, December. Live weights have been 80 to 90 pounds and carcasses 40 to 45. So you're saying that you're getting 80 to 90 pounds on buckthorn from just April, May to December, or, you know, October, December?
Yeah, hi. So not specifically buckthorn. I've been grazing in kind of a variety of woodland, but the primary species that we've been targeting have been like black raspberry and multiflora rose and honeysuckle, kind of that family of stuff, and not so much buckthorn. And then they've been doing some work in transitional pastures, so pastures that had been forestry mowed, then the goats grazed, and then shady pasture mix being established. So there have been a few points throughout the grazing season that they have had access to grassy pasture, but they tend to prefer the woody species anyways. So they're growing really well on, traditional forages.
Cool.
That's super cool to hear. Thanks so much for sharing that, Bailey. I think, forage analysis of some of these understory species is going to be really important moving forward. And I wonder at that difference between the honeysuckle raspberry family and then the buckthorn family. Thanks so much for sharing. Gary said, are sheep desirable plants similar to the goat listed on edible plants shared? Gary, you're asking the difference in palatability and in desirability for sheep versus goats, I think. I would say goats tend to be browsers I talk about it as sort of a spectrum from cows to goats. Cows are kind of your main grazer. They're going to eat a little bit of woody species. Sheep are mainly grazing, but they'll go more readily toward the woody species, particularly once you get into the hair sheep, which tend to be a little bit more similar to goats on the spectrum. They will do a great job of understory management for woody species. And then goats really prefer browsing and will graze if they've been taught to. I've worked with goats that only eat grass because that's all they've been exposed to. And I've worked with goats that only eat, really don't eat grass unless forced to do so until it's winter time. So I would think for desirability in that list that I provided earlier, the hair sheep will go pretty readily for a lot of the species listed. I have not put them on buckthorn, and I actually don't really know how they do on it. If anybody does, do let me know. But I know some producers like Steve Gabriel out in Ithaca, he uses hair sheep in his silvopasture and on his pastures, and they do a great job of both moving between pasture grasses and that understory that he's developed over time. But they manage the woody species for quite a while. I will move on to the next slide then. So now we're going to get into some of the project profiles, the browsing project profiles, and then we'll talk a little bit about the sheep as well, but quickly we'll go over the browsing. These are two different projects. One is the project on the left with the wall of buckthorn on the side of it is that same one where with the picture of the dog out in the southeastern Minnesota, and you can see this is a really nice demonstration of a wall of buckthorn that the property to their south has, and then what this couple has been able to achieve through their own work and with the goats, and just how much the goats really do kind of reduce the wall and allow you to see almost to the prairie that's behind the forest back there. And then the picture on the right is one that we will go deeper into, the Chris Carilla WMA out in New Munich that we worked on with the DNR and Wildlife Forever. This one is really cool and interesting, and we'll just continue on, but I think it's nice to see the difference in that savanna that they've managed to the left of the picture versus the sort of grassy prairie to the right that they have not managed at all. So before we get there, we're going to talk about the Minnesota History Center. I think this one's a really fun one. I'll run through it kind of quickly here. We've been managing it for about 10 years. We planted native seed and we did native plugs as well, plant plugs. And we've had a lot of trouble seeing the prairie express itself in this 1/4 acre plot across from the Minnesota History Center. In part because we've been burning it as the management tool. And it's been tricky to do so because we are downtown. There's a hospital right next door. There's airport right nearby. The capital is right across the road. So it's very difficult to find the right time to burn this piece of land with the right wind considerations and just timing in general. So that on top of the fact that the species that we're managing are sumac and then crown vetch, which aren't managed well at the time that we are able to burn in the early spring. And so we saw that those two species continue to thrive, and the species that we were hoping for weren't doing as well. So we brought in goats this year for the first time, and they managed the sumac and the crown vetch quite well. We brought them in twice over the course of the summer in June and September. And in the second time we brought them, we laid down a very large volume of native seed to try to reinvigorate that piece of land. We put it at the top so that as the seed trickles down the hill, they can grab hold and try to really get that whole hill invigorated again. And we're really excited about the results and hope to return next year to continue managing it and see some of those native species come back. When we first went and looked at it in May, we couldn't find any really signs of native species, except for at the very bottom, just a few. And when we came back in mid-August, before agreeing to do a second browse, we looked at the results of the first browse and saw a lot of native species had started to pop up just from opening up that ground to some light and water availability and potentially allowing them to receive some more nutrients as we impacted the sumac and the crown vetch. Here's another example of that, the before and after on our first browse. And you can see the impact that they had in just kind of, again, opening up that understory. It's kind of easy to see, I think personally, the left side, that a small species, wouldn't be able to necessarily get any flight with the crown vetch and the sumac taking over, where after the management, you can really see that that has been opened up. It reminds me of old images of sheep on the White House lawn. I agree. I think the more places we can get livestock in funky places where people don't think about them, the better it is. And this was a lovely opportunity for us to talk with people about the importance of returning livestock to the land. And folks were very receptive. The kids were very, very happy to see the goats too. And then this is that property I was speaking about earlier, the Chris Carilla WMA. This project is really neat. We proposed 3 browses over the course of one season that we're going to cover 16 acres of this deciduous forest within the WMA. Just to the east of the deciduous forest, there is a beautiful prairie that is a part of it as well. And to the west of it, there is a wetland and then further fields. And so there's a lot of area around this that the DNR is managing. And so our ability to come in and kind of support some of their function by bringing our goats in was a really lovely partnership, in my opinion. They had forestry mowed the understory of the deciduous forest, the 2019 and in 2020. And so, 2019, 20, and then 20 and 21. They forestry mowed the understory. So we came into about a knee-high buckthorn grove, I would say, and that is just a goat heaven. And so we were able to pretty easily, and manage, put up fences, things like that. We brought our stock tank out and we rotated the goats in 3 pastures that were about 5 acres each. And we did that once in June. We came back in August, September. And we were originally planning on doing the 3 browses in 1 year, but come mid-May, we all realized that probably there wouldn't be enough water that summer to allow for the flush that we were looking for to manage again. And we decided to, at that time, divert and put the 3rd browse off until 2022 growing season, which I think really was the right choice. I think the drought and hammering the buckthorn twice in one summer was really helpful because the buckthorn wasn't really able to spring back as well as it may have been able to in a lush season. And so we were really hammering at the resources that the buckthorn held underground. But I think trying to do it a 3rd time would have been not very cost effective nor environmentally effective. So here's an image again of that kind of comparison between where the goats were coming into and then what they were leaving. This picture is interesting because it demonstrates that we did bring a FLIRD into this site. So we had goats and sheep together the second time we ran the animals through this property. The first time we ran them through, we just had goats and they really hammered at the buckthorn, but left a lot of the other species alone. We potentially could have left them in for longer to hammer at the other species, but chose not to and move them along, which I do wonder at the choice around bringing the sheep in, because obviously you can see from the picture on the right that they annihilated all the grasses and things like that the goats didn't go after because there's just no vegetation left. And I kind of wonder if that's beneficial or slightly harmful in the sense that potentially leaving the grass on the ground would help again create some of that competition for the buckthorn. Whereas, reducing it at the same time as the buckthorn might just create everybody in competition together. I've thought about it. I don't really have answers, and I think it'll be interesting to see what comes of in the spring when we start seeing the flush at Kurilla, see what the different paddocks look like based on how they've been managed for that. So I think that's an important piece. And then the other piece I think is important is the future use of this land. I've talked with the managers a few times, and of course my interest would be to see livestock out managing it or potentially fire one day, but I do know that the DNR is really dedicated to ensuring that this does stay as a savanna once the initial management has been completed. And it's going to be a really beautiful savanna. So sometime I would suggest driving by. This one we can kind of blaze through quickly. I think was it Wayne, your point earlier about how much the goats will impact. This is the picture on the right is, no, sorry, the picture on the left is the picture as before we entered with the goats, even the first time. That was right before we started our second paddock. You can see at the very edge of that picture, the fence is up and the goats have kind of browsed. But that's before we entered the first time. And then the picture to the right is before we entered the second time. And I know like it might not look like they've done a lot, but it's kind of, and you can kind of see in some of the shrubby areas of the buckthorn that the stems are showing and that the buckthorn hasn't really come back in full force. And I think it's important to think about, had we not managed at all, that picture on the left was taken in mid-June, and the picture on the right was taken mid-September. So had we not managed at all, the picture on the right would look really, really different come mid-September. I think that whole area would have been really filled with buckthorn that would have been up to kind of chest height potentially at that point. Whereas we were able to reduce it and harm it after only just that one browse. Personally, I think this shows that what their limitations are and what they're able to do. They're not going to impact it after one browse, but they are going to help you get ahead of it. And they will impact it with dedicated repeat browses.
So we have a question here, Audrey,
Yeah.
from Jody wants to know, when you bring in the goats, how long are they typically at a location and how long between grazing sessions?
Yeah, that's
And
a good question. Yeah, I can see Molly's too, Carl. I'll
Sure.
head up that afterwards. So when we bring the goats in, we try to keep them there. I guess it depends a lot. We're a little bit less picky about the duration with the goats than we are with the sheep because of different management desires. So the goats is really, we're trying to create a high intensity, and high density stocking situation so that they have competition and will kind of evenly move through the site. That being said, we try to keep them on a site for probably no longer than 2 weeks at a time. And then in terms of rest period, It really varies based on the landowner or land manager's objectives and our ability to get back to them. But, I think trying to, yeah, I think it's just dependent. The project that I've spoken about a few times in southeastern Minnesota, we had rest periods about 3 weeks, and we went there 3 times within the season. And then some of the other projects we worked on, we had rest periods about 6 weeks. And this project here was a rest period of, that was more like 8 weeks, I would say. So you can see the regrowth after 8 weeks on that side. Some projects we only do once a year, though. We have a few sites where we have gone, we had a 60-acre site in the west. Of course, we were there for longer than 2 weeks. We ended up being there for about 6 weeks. And we only graze once or browse once a year there, but we're seeing really great results as well. And then Molly, to your point, if you have 20 acres, is it preferable to do a few smaller paddocks or a bigger herd and do all 20 at once? That's a really great question, Molly. We talk about that a lot. And for us, it comes down to so many different considerations that might be really different for other folks. Our considerations are labor and mobilization, and then whether the trailer is going to be, what trailers we have free and whether they will be free at the time we need them. And so what we've landed on generally is it's better to just fence a large space and put a lot of animals into it. The cost and labor of fencing is just so high. If you can reduce that, it's a huge boon, I think, for us. And so we do try to really keep high stocking density, keep a lot of our herd together and move it around as one to try to keep those numbers up. Again, when we do that, we just make sure that the solar fencers or whatever fencer we're using isn't being overloaded and unable to do its job. So that was all of the projects I had for goats to talk about. I'm happy to continue to talk about them, but I think quickly before we are done, which will be soon, I suppose, I wanted to go over what some of our sheep are doing. And oh, that's how you do it. Okay. Some of our sheep are doing, we have Katahdins. Generally, again, they're on solar. We did do one project this year where they were helping restore a prairie. The way we did it was we took a field of brome grass and of goldenrod, and the burn crew went in April, burned the plot. And then we came back in late May and ate up the brome that was left or regrowing after the burn, as well as the goldenrod, and trample seeded sorghum at the same time. So we'd had our install group had come in and laid down sorghum across a 20-acre field, and then the sheep went in and trampled it. The hope is the sorghum will grow back and then be able to be burned in the spring, at which point then I believe the sheep will be returning and we will be working toward planting native seed to establish a native prairie without using herbicide. So we are heading at it with multiple different tools, trying to see what we can do to try to manage this prairie and restore it, or restore the prairie without using chemicals, but rather using livestock and burning. We're really excited to see where this project goes and have been working with a lot of different groups on that one. And then the sheep grazing on the solar is really cool subject, I think, because it brings across many different industries that are working towards similar goals. And I think this one shows just how well they can do on the solar prairies that we plant. This solar prairie was planted about three years ago and is coming out pretty lush. You can see here a black-eyed Susan, but we are starting to see the plants that come up after black-eyed Susans, bergamot, things like that, the prairie is becoming very lush. So when we entered, this was one of the more lush sites we entered this summer, and we had our ewe lambs on this actually. So, they were 50 pounds when they got on there, but we had about 400 on a 15-acre site for a little longer than we keep our ewes on, back to that animal unit piece, which is so important. And they did a really, really wonderful job. You can see that they impacted up quite high, above their own height, and ate down all of the thatch on that prairie and really reduced the fire risk. Actually, I didn't realize this before, but Gus is in that picture as well at the bottom, hiding underneath the solar panel. And I think it's important. One of the main things that we work on with solar developers, owner operators, is that fire reduction, fire risk reduction and thatch reduction. And then on the side, you can see, again, just the difference it would be for a tech to walk through and manage the solar panels or go and check on a box is just really vastly different after we've impacted it. And we're really lucky that a lot of the folks we work with are understanding of the environmental benefits of sheep and willing to wait for that impact. But you can see the, the way that they've managed around solar or electric boxes and things. There's not really concern around wires. They don't chew them. They don't get that curious. They're generally just pretty happy eating cottonwoods and all of the tasty species within the arrays. Yep. Ralph said, do you limit the grazers on solar sites to only sheep? We do. I know that recently Dean spoke about the using cows on solar, and I know that's something that I think that's a really important next step personally. But we only use sheep. We're not allowed to bring goats because they're too naughty. Is the sheep grazing cheaper for the utility owner than mowing? That's a really great question, Tyler. It's something we talk a lot about. Currently, it is not. I think it will be soon. I think there's a number of reasons. Sheep do such a wonderful job at providing, nutrients to the soil and creating really healthy plant ecosystems. So, and reduce the open ground and things for weeds to grow. And so over time, we are seeing these prairies as they are established and being managed with sheep. We're seeing fewer and fewer invasive species or undesired species on these plots, meaning that we have the less need for weed whip crews to come through, less need for spraying to happen. And so for those of you not involved in solar very much, the spectrum tends to be mowing and then weed whipping and spraying throughout the season. And there's timing around all of that based on species and availability of crews. And being able to reduce the use of herbicide and weed whipping does reduce the cost over time because you're sending fewer crews out and you're managing less just less moving pieces. If we're able to bring sheep in once or twice throughout the season, drop them off and they can eat and then we can take them, that's going to be less management than sending a mowing crew, weed whipping and herbaceous spraying. So currently the cost per acre is on par with weed whipping, mowing and spraying. And as we continue forward, I foresee it going down or staying this as it is while the other mechanical functions continue to increase. Something I was going to say to that, but I don't remember, so I will continue on. One thing I did want to cover is that we really push pollinator habitat in solar and really in anywhere that we can, because MNL's mission is to heal the earth, and we do so really with a focus on native species and pollinator habitat. And so we really highlight the solar site pollinator assessment card and make sure that folks are aware of the impact it can have for developers and owner operators, in that it allows for quicker zoning and planning permitting processes, particularly around stormwater. But then it also is really, I think, an important piece in demonstrating to the communities in which we're putting these solar arrays that we're there to support healthy living and healthy rural spaces. The pollinator habitat planting native and using livestock or some sort of agrivoltaics are, I think, the best ways to get communities on board for adding solar to their land. And I think that's a really important piece that sometimes gets overlooked, is that we are moving often onto people's land, into people's communities, and making sure that we're getting townships and counties and larger, on board is essential in moving forward with solar. And I think this is a really great way of making sure that developers are following through with some of the some of what they have stated they're interested in doing, such as taking care of the land in Minnesota. So I'm really, really pleased that Minnesota does this, and we're really supportive of using the pollinator scorecard to help move solar forward. Well, I know, we're kind of out of time here, but we do work, we highlight are the MDA, Minnesota Department of Agriculture study that we do, funded in part by SFA. So really wonderful, and thank you. Diverse plant species diversity on prairies under solar, and trying to figure out or demonstrate that grazing sheep on these sites does increase the plant diversity. And we are pointing toward that direction.
Cool.
We also work with NREL on plant coverage under solar, and Temple. I have more to go in on that, but I don't know that that's helpful now.
Yeah. I think we should wrap it up. The partnerships that you mentioned, and I think many of us are involved with, are so important. We have to break down these barriers and silos and disciplines to capture these multiple benefits.
I'm having trouble hearing you, and I just want to say
Most unfortunate. You're really breaking up. I think you were saying thanks to everybody.
Yep. Feel free to reach out. I'll give you
Thank you so much. If people want
my
to
email.
Put their contact information in the chat, you can also find you, of course, at the Minnesota Native Landscape website. Thank you, everybody. Sorry about that glitch at the end. You were coming through really well. Thank you, Audrey, so much. Wealth of knowledge, and I think we're all the people that have the livestock out there are gaining such great experience, and a lot of thank yous there in the chat. And so I think with that, talk to your representatives about rural broadband. Okay, so we're going to do that. This should not happen. And Katie, thank you so much. And please check out the Ecological Service Livestock Network page on the Sustainable Farming Association site. Thanks, everybody. And keep those cards and letters coming if you have any suggestions for topics or presentations. And hopefully this summer, we will get out and meet in person. Imagine that.